I decided to do my project on my mom's side of the family as I found it very interesting. In the 17th century, my great-grandfather, Gerard Boulanger's ancestors, lived in New France, and after the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, New France was won by Britain, which they changed the name to Quebec. My great-grandfather was born on July 12, 1906, in Saint-Thérèbe, Quebec, son of Joseph Boulanger and Epiphane de Sablon. My great-grandmother, Yvonne Ludic, Gerard Boulanger's wife, was born on February 1, 1912 in Saint-Casimir, Quebec, the daughter of Wilfred Ludic and Leontine Savouget. In 1927, when Yvonne was 15, she moved from Quebec to the west of Canada with her father and brother to watch the house while they farmed on rented land. Yvonne's father worked with my great-grandfather, Gerard, so Yvonne always heard stories about him. Yvonne officially met Gerard later that year, and they got married a year later in 1928. Gerard was 21 and Yvonne was 16. They had a child that year and kept having children until 1956. Throughout this time period, R.B. Bennett was the Prime Minister, and they lived in Canada throughout the Great Depression, but it did not affect them a whole lot. They had to move a few times and travel by horse to work at different farms. But in 1944, they ended up settling in Estevan, Saskatchewan, where they lived in a friend's house packed with 19 people for 2 weeks. They then moved to their own farm, where they raised animals like chickens, cows, pigs, and horses. They also had a large garden of vegetables. They provided themselves with food and made money by selling potatoes and milk. In 1946, my grandma Anita was born, along with her twin sister Annette. My grandma Anita started grade 1 in Estevan and finished the rest of the grade in Beanfate. She then stayed in Beanfate until grade 9. She found school very difficult at the beginning. Being a full-time French speaker at home and having to learn English at school was very difficult. In grade 9, when my grandma was 15, she met a boy at a dance who she fell for instantly. That boy was my grandpa, Johnny Fleck. My name is Johnny Fleck. This is my story, but I will start by telling you of my father, Jacob Fleck. He was born July 1897 and was the youngest of 11 children. His father was a school teacher who passed away when Jacob was about 9 years old. His mother remarried, then she passed away when he was 11. So now he lived with his stepfather, who later remarried. His stepfather was a kind man, but the lady he married was not. She would have nothing to do with Jacob because he was not real blood to his stepfather. She mistreated him so badly that by the time he was 13, he had to leave, be an orphan that nobody wanted. He would work for food for farmers until he was 18, when he was drafted to the Russian army at the time Poland proclaimed war on Russia. He fought in the war for a time, and then enlisted to be a medic. He would treat wounds of Russian soldiers as well as wounds of the enemies. He was in the army for 6 years, and when he came home shortly after, he married my mother, Veronica Rusk. They had 9 children. 2 of the children died during the Black Plague, where many people died. The 9 children were Barbara, Ralph, Rosie, and Johnny, who died. The next girl born was Rose, Joseph, Ottilia, and then I was born, Johnny, and then Jacob. I was born December 14, 1938, in a little village called Schonfeld. It was in the Ukraine, near the closest city of Odessa. There were fruit trees and vineyards, and people made wine there. The wine was made by stripping my younger brother and I down into our shorts. We were put into a barrel where they would dump pails of grapes, and we had to trample these grapes so that there couldn't be any whole grapes left. Then the juices were drained, and I don't know what they did, but the wine was very good. I even had the chance to taste it. We lived in a sod house. It had 2 rooms, one kitchen, and the other was a living room, and a bedroom was one. The floor was dirt. The beds were built of wood. The mattresses were big bags filled with straw or corn leaves, and the covers and pillows were bags filled with down. The Second World War had started and was invaded by the Germans in 1941 and were under German rule until 1944, when the Germans had to retreat out of Russia. Since we were of German descent, we had to leave Russia or suffer the consequences that the Germans had imposed for the Russians. We left our homes in covered wagons, taking with us little as possible, just food and some clothes. We would travel like this for months until the war caught up to us. Then, with what little we had left, we had to leave behind out on the trains in Poland, where we ended up. Now I was 5, about to turn 6, in December when I would start school in grade 1. This was the fall of 1944. My parents worked for this rich Polish farmer that had to put us up. He was not a happy man, because he was forced to take in many displaced families, as we were called at the time. We were then there until spring of 1945, when we had to move again. Women and children were put on trucks, and then men had to walk. We thought that we had lost our father. We were put on trains and there headed for Germany. There was very little food, but we ended up in Germany in a camp where there were thousands of displaced families, but no men. My father made it to Germany and searched camp after camp for us, and finally he found us. A rich farmer came and got us to work on his farm. The war was going quite strong, but the Germans were losing the battle, and soon the war was over. In 1946, the schools opened, and I was now 7, started grade 1, once again. I now had to learn to speak real German, known as the High German. Here, schools would start at 7 a.m., and we were finished by noon. The teachers were very strict, but recess was very fun. We played football, handball, and tag the batter. We raised rabbits for food. It was one of my chores to keep their pens clean, and the rabbits fed so they wouldn't get sick. In 1947, we were allowed to send letters to the other countries, and my dad knew his older brother, Frank Fleck, had left Russia and came to Canada to a small town called Latman, Saskatchewan, in 1916, but he didn't know if he was still there. He sent a letter away and soon got a letter back. My dad had been in 2 world wars through communism, and he had enough of the European countries, so we asked his older brother Frank, if possible, to get us out of Germany, and he did. We came to Canada in September of 1948. I again started school in grade 1, now 9 years old, and didn't know a word of English. Try and imagine, not being able to communicate with other students and teachers. It was very hard. But after a few fights and straps from the teacher, I learned to communicate quite soon. The first winter in Canada was a lot colder than in Germany, and my family didn't have the right clothes for the cold weather, and our feet froze, and it was very painful when they thawed out. In the fall of 1949, Dad rented a farm about 15 miles from Latman, and I went to a new country school called Albany until I went to work on the farm with my parents. In 1961, I met a girl at a dance. Her name was Anita Fleck. After my grandma and grandpa met at the dance, they dated for 4 months and got married and rented a farm for 4 years, where they had 3 children. In 1966, they bought their own farm by Benson, where my mother, Cindy, was born. My mom lived in Benson until she was in 5th grade. Then she moved into Estevan, where she finished high school. My mom met my dad in grade 10, and 12 years later, I was born. Here I am today, a 3rd-generation Canadian on my grandfather's side, and a 7th-generation Canadian on my grandmother's side. I've realized that throughout history, many things have changed. There are way more jobs rather than farming and just a couple others, which offer way better pay, making living in Canada a lot easier than it used to be.